All right, you've heard the ideas. Now let's make them work. Welcome to the Practice Exchange from concept to reality, part of the Business Architecture Forum broadcast network, where we take the ideas that you hear at events and boardrooms and turn them into practical action. Now, today's guest is Ben Chamberlain. He's the founder of the Strategy Execution Forum. Ben has spent years exploring why organizations seem to struggle to turn strategy into results and what it takes to execute more effectively. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, Ben, was there a particular moment in your career where you realized strategy execution was a bigger challenge than most organizations recognized? And ultimately, what led you to create the Strategy Execution Forum?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been involved in strategy execution for longer than I care to remember, right? At the forum, we say that it takes a village to master strategy execution. So you've got to bring together all the critical functions and processes needed to effectively execute on strategy. So I think, based on your role and function, you've probably been contributing to strategy execution at some point in your career, right? I started life as a project manager, right, in the construction industry, then kind of moved to consulting in terms of PMO and sort of governance setup, and then got mixed up in an organization called UMT in 2002 that had an opinion in terms of what portfolio management should be, more than just dashboarding, but how to align all activity and spend with strategy. We ended up building frameworks and software, that kind of brought that to life. And the software ended up getting acquired by Microsoft, and then we spun off and created some new software around strategic portfolio management, right, which all became kind of Gartner recognized in different quadrants, etc. Right. So I've kind of approached the space for years, and more from a kind of portfolio program project standpoint, but more on the sort of vendor and consulting side. So building technology and frameworks that help organizations to, align and execute investments against strategy. So I guess I've been doing that for 30 years. And what I, having sold the last company, I started to think, okay, what am I going to do next, right? And as I spent some time sort of retrospectively thinking about customer conversations, from 2017 to 2023, and certainly spent some time looking on LinkedIn more than I've ever done before. It seemed there's a level of frustration out there of an organization's ability to bridge the gap between strategy and execution, and everyone seems to be talking about it from their own vantage point, whether that's the PMO, whether that's from a business or enterprise architecture point of view, from a strategy point of view, right? So everyone's talking about it. And I was a little bit frustrated by that. It's like I've been involved in this space forever. I feel like I've, moved the needle. Maybe it was, small ripple, big pond. But why are we struggling so much still? Because I know that organizations have invested significantly in this over the last, 20 years from a process point of view and certainly from a tooling point of view. So you know, that's what got me to think about establishing the forum to say, okay, well, if I'm going to stay in this space and I want to, have an impact in the last, stretch of my career, right? Let's figure out why organizations are struggling and see what we can do about it.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a really your background and how you came to that. I think a lot of people are going to be able to resonate with that because we do sit in our seats and we see everything that's happening. We're like, why is this so hard? It's not that hard if you just let us have that conversation, right? So as you were kind of looking with your 30 years and as you were bringing together the community, what kept on showing up across those different organizations or stories, regardless of the industry or size?
Yeah, well, before deciding to establish the strategy execution forum, and I'll tell you more about that. I said, okay, well, what are the main reasons or what are the root causes for why I believe that organizations are struggling with strategy execution? And I think, the problem is when we look at it from our own domain, whether that's, PPM or whether that's architecture or strategy or whatever it may be, right? We can often get lost in the minutia, right, of that. And there are probably hundreds of reasons that all sum up to why organizations struggle to do that. But that's not necessarily helpful, right? So I started thinking about it for a while, and then I came up with sort of three kind of main root causes, right, that I think is holding organizations back. The first is that the C-suite don't necessarily understand what strategy execution is, right? And they certainly don't understand how much it's costing them, right? Or what's the cost of suboptimal strategy execution capabilities. I think that often people think of strategy execution more of kind of program management in steroids because it's kind of linked with the major big bets or transformational initiatives that organizations need to play out. So when we sat down in the forum and say we've got a fixed strategy execution forum, we came up with a definition, and one of the key parts of that definition is it should be focused on all activity and spend, not just the projects and programs, but the operational activity and spend that needs to be rationalized, optimized, and aligned with the strategy, which is architecture has a big role to play in that. So the first thing is the C-suite doesn't really understand what it is, and it doesn't understand the amount of value that's being lost. And we can talk maybe about that more, during this session because I think it is significant, lost and also delayed. The second and probably is the most important is it we say it takes a village to master strategy execution, right? And that's very true, right? Because we got all these critical functions that ultimately need to play well in the sandbox together, right?
Right.
And need to be able to work together and optimize those critical processes to execute on strategy. And we don't. We're siloed in nature when you look at most organizations, and we're all passionate about our specific function or role or capability, right? So whether it's the PMO, whether it's architecture, whether it's strategy, whether it's operations, doesn't matter whether it's FP&A, right? Whether it's project execution, we're all passionate about that, right? And we kind of just focus on optimizing our own domain, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. But when you actually pull that all together across the enterprise, I think you end up with a fractured operating model, right? And staying with that kind of value analogy, the value is seeping through the cracks where those teams should perfectly adjoin, but they're not,
Yeah.
right? So I
Right.
think that's kind of number two. And number three is that kind of one size fits all, or ultimately one size fits no one frameworks, right? Now I can talk more from the project program portfolio management side of the house where I spent most of my time, but it feels like every 10 years there's a new methodology that comes out that's going to solve world hunger and world peace. It was, project and portfolio management was kind of waterfall centric, and then it moved into more recently sort of agile transformation, right?
Right.
Promising that somehow things were going to be different, and we end up at a different destination, maybe, but not necessarily the destination that we were expecting. I think that's another reason. I think the same happens in architecture, the same happens in the other domains, right? Where every 10 years and quite a tweak to the process comes out, normally driven by the consulting organizations that are kind of selling the same services through a slightly different lens, right? And
Yeah.
the reason it fails isn't just because of one size fits no one. It's because ultimately, strategy execution processes and the overall capability needs to be personalized to the idiosyncrasies, culture, and nuances of every organization, right? What works for you in one organization, right? You can't just pick that up and apply it to another organization because it may fall short based on the politics or dynamics of that organization, right? And I think that's where often things go wrong, right? We try and from each of the main functions or each of the village members or key roles, kind of optimize our domain using whatever the latest thinking is, right? And that doesn't perfectly join with the other things, right? And it doesn't fit the culture of necessarily the organization, right? You can't just apply
Right.
a textbook approach to this stuff, right?
I really like what you were talking about with the three root causes or the things that you're saying, right? Like sometimes leaders don't understand what strategy execution truly is. We have a lot of silos. We have a lot of groups that are kind of working within with their own perspective, right? And we try to do these really large scale, one size fits all methodologies. From your experience and what you've seen or what others have seen as well, which of those do you think tend to show up first?
Oh, um, well, I think they all show up. I mean, to me, the siloed nature of an organization is just how organizations are built, right? So, all these functions, whether it's architecture or it's operations or it's strategy, whether it's, PMOs in different domains or a transformation office, if there's an enterprise function, that they're all operating in silos. That's just reality. The one size fits all solutions is just a reality too. I think personally that what will make a difference in terms of mastering strategy execution or finally, bridging the gap between strategy and execution is going to be the C-suite understanding what it is, right? And then sponsoring the development of that capability, or like we say in the forum, the development of that strategy execution muscle across the organization. Because invariably, throughout my career, when I think about who was buying my software and frameworks, right, we were often selling to the kind of mid-level, right, in different business units in the organization. Very rarely did we approach this top down with C-suite backing to kind of drive this across the organization. It was normally, get into one pocket, start in IT, and then move into another business unit, try and go laterally then up. And you don't have that executive support to be able to drive this across the organization. At the strategy execution forum, we talk about mastering both the art and science of strategy execution, right? The science could be,
Right.
whatever, frameworks and plays you're going to use, right? But the art is the human dimension, the human obstacles you've got to overcome, right? And I think just think about those silos. How do you bring those silos together? It's very difficult to do that through just influence in laterally in the organization. You really need the C-suite say that this is critical for our organization because we understand what it is, we understand the value that is at risk, and we got to develop this muscle and purposely come together to break those silos. And without that
Yeah.
top-down commitment to making that change, I think it would happen. So I think that the one size fits all or the different types of methodology over the years is just a reality. It's always there. The siloed nature of organization, that's just how most organizations are built. The thing we don't see showing up and the thing that we want to influence in the strategy execution forum, hence our kind of tagline of elevating strategy execution to be a C-suite imperative, is to get the C-suite bought in that this is something that we can fix.
Right.
It's something that we can take with the functions that exist in the organization, so architecture and the other key functions. We can build a cohesive operating model that will make a difference, that will finally move the needle, because I really believe it is about getting the best out of the teams that already exist, right? And building that cohesive operating model versus each one slightly working against each other to have that kind of fractured operating model.
That's right. I really like what you say about getting the C-suite on board because oftentimes, especially when we look at org change or change management or the behavior of change, right? We need to be able to change the hearts and minds, and that change, direction, and support needs to come from the top. And I think oftentimes that gets missed. So for folks who are either practicing business architects or enterprise architects, or obviously working within a practice in order to really realize that silo or to realize the village aspect of this, it sounds like we got to be able to partner with other groups in order to maybe help with that messaging or to help get that in front of the C-suite in order for them to capture that idea and really buy into it. What are your thoughts on doing more of that collaboration with other areas within the strategy execution framework?
I think it's critical, and probably the function that understands the silo nature of an organization most is probably the architects, right? By the fact that they're actually mapping, and optimizing the operating fabric of the business, right? But look, I think what we need to do, and we'll talk, I'm sure we're going to talk more about this. So what we did at the Strategy Execution Forum, I decided to build the Strategy Execution Forum to bring multidisciplinary leaders and practitioners together to start this discussion, to understand the criticality of each other's role and understand how these teams and of course the critical capabilities. We say there are kind of 5 critical capabilities we've got to integrate and optimize: strategic portfolio management, business and enterprise architecture, FP&A, whatever flavor of project execution, agile, traditional, otherwise it doesn't really matter, and change management. How these different teams and how these critical capabilities need to come together to build that cohesive operating model. Now, to do that, we need to establish and build on 10 key principles to master strategy execution. These 10 key principles have been defined by the community members, these multidisciplinary leaders that have come together. Now, the first principle is how to expose the cost of poor strategy execution capabilities. And this is all geared to getting C-suite buy-in and commitment to taking strategy execution seriously and making it an enterprise discipline that they're going to develop over time to claw back the value that's being lost and delayed. Now, how to do that is the big question, right? Because often it's going
Right.
to start with the teams needing to come together to have that pitch to the C-suite to get them to buy in, and it's better to do that as an integrated collective than individually, because often I'm seeing the architect saying, "Listen, the, to bridge the gap between strategy and execution, it's strategy, architecture, execution, relegating all the kind of execution project management under architecture." And I agree with that. I believe that business architecture and obviously enterprise architecture with the technology element is critical. But you've got the same thing. You've got PMI just came out with PMBOK 8, right? Saying it's all about value management office now. And we've got to have a rebranded PMO at the enterprise level, and it's all about value management. But they're focused just on the project side of the house, right? And we all
Right.
know that the C-suite often think of a PMO as an overly bureaucratic function, right? Expensive, maybe not necessarily there to accelerate things, right? Which is wrong, but so you've got all these different teams kind of elevating their pitch, right?
Yep.
And it falls short because it's the collective and integrated nature of this that's important. So what I think to actually go and get that C-suite commitment, you've got to tell that integrated story, which means let's get the architects together, let's get the PMO together, let's get the other functions, the strategy folks together to come up with what that pitch is, what's that value case for building a cohesive operating model, right?
And
And
that's
and
hard work. I mean, what you're talking about
yeah,
there, I mean, that's being willing to have more vulnerability um, within the practice itself. It's understanding where the different roles fit in, and you've really got to bring that mindset of we're better together. We don't need to operate in silos, right? We're all here for a reason, and we are far stronger and better if we can all work together rather than going at it alone. And I
well,
think,
it's the reality of what needs to happen anyway, right? I mean,
yeah,
obviously, the
absolutely.
architecture team can look at understanding the current architecture of the organization or operating fabric of the organization, set course to a target stake architecture that's going to help us deliver on our strategy. But you need the project people there to be able to execute on that, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
You
Yep.
need the strategy people to be able to ensure the strategy is right to interpret into the architecture. So it is a team sport, right? and
It is.
we need to come together. And I think yes, no, the often when these functions go and pitch to the C-suite, it's not like this hasn't happened before. We see this enterprise because what we say is once we've got the C-suite commitment, we need an enterprise function that's going to orchestrate this change across the organization. Obviously, these enterprise functions exist today, right? They do
Yep.
exist. But
Transformation office is an
yeah,
example of that.
transformation
Yep.
office, change management office, enterprise PMO, right? Maybe the transformation officers are looking at overhauling the operating fabric of the business, which looks at the wholesale change to the architecture, right? But I often feel that those functions today have been reactively created, right? They've been
Yes.
reactive created because we got an EPMO because some programs are going off the rails, right? So we have now an EPMO that's just focusing on trying to get those programs back on the rails, or we have a transformation office because there's a big one-off transformation, digital or otherwise, or because it's all about people, we've created a change management office. And we're focusing more on the people dynamic, right? Versus some of the,
Right.
or maybe there's financially we're struggling as an organization, so we need to rationalize some operational costs, right? Which means that a rationalization optimization of our operating model where architecture becomes the main focus, right? But they're
Yeah,
reactively created to fix one of these issues, right? Versus proactively created and backed by the C-suite because they know that value is at risk, right? Business
that's right.
value is at risk, right? Um, and I think that's a big difference because also when you're reactively creating a function like that, it's often expensive because it comes often with a consulting price tag, big four price tag to come and fix this problem, right? And I think that's another mistake because ultimately, going back to no one size fits all, you need to personalize that strategy execution capability across the organization by unifying the village. And so you need that enterprise function whatever you want to call it, we call it a strategy execution office. The name is irrelevant. That really acts as the architects, not the business architects, the architects of the strategy execution capability to unify the village to develop that muscle, right? And that's a lean team of people who understand the business, right? They're not
Right.
necessarily hired guns from outside Big Four consulting that's going to kind of apply the playbook from three other customers and miss the mark because it's not going to be, personalized to that specific organization.
And frankly, it's hard sometimes to get the right people in the room. Sometimes folks might be walking into situations where there was maybe a bad experience, maybe another group had come in. Sometimes with the CIO doing the buy-in, and to your point around like the PMO framework that just came out, sometimes we operate internally like we're competing with each other. And I think we need to set aside that competition. It's not about being first to market with a good idea. If you've got a great idea, there's probably other groups that also have similar ideas or can find ways that they can get excited and also help. And I think that's a really, really big takeaway, which I appreciate the principles that you've outlined here. Really hit that.
Well, I think on that, it's, you know, I mean, we see all the stats out there, right? I mean, there've been some of the same stats have been there for 20 years of, X% of transformation fails. They're normally stats greater than 65%, right? 70% of this, Gartner, 70% of, strategic initiatives will fail to deliver or a risk of failing to deliver the anticipated outcomes, right? Whatever. There's all these big stats out there that I think go in one ear, out the other ear, right? Because they're super high level. And as I imagine, as a C-suite executive, you have no idea how to fix that. Fine, right? That's why I feel like they often think of strategy execution as program management on steroids, right? It's not, because that doesn't really address the operational side of the business. But then you think of program management, it's not a perfect science, right? So there's some waste involved in that, right? You're going to drop some value. But can we highlight to the execs by bringing the teams together, what is the value at risk, right? And therefore, if it's significant, which we can look at that, and I think it is, then how do we go and fix that, right? If we are plumbers, how do we fix the leaks in the plumbing to be able to get better throughput of value, but and
Yeah.
acceleration of value in the organization? And I think that's important, right? Because you go away from that kind of opaque 70%, 65% shock and awe number into what are really the leading indicators for business value erosion. And I think as project program portfolio people or as enterprise or business architects or as operation people or strategy, we all have, or change management people, we all have metrics up to wazoo, right? 100 metrics we're going to evaluate our function against, right? But
Right.
none of those are, well, some of them are, but very few of those are true leading indicators to business value erosion, right? And I think that's what matters, right? So I started to look at this the other day, and it's far from complete. And actually, I need help from Baf and Linda in terms of finalizing this from the architecture point of view. But what are the kind of leading indicators for business value erosion, right? And if we present that to the executive team, that you don't have to be an expert architect or you don't have to be an expert in project or portfolio execution to understand, right? You can show them if I start to fix this, and this, the reality is more value is going to flow, quicker, right? And so we started to look at that, and the kind of two key areas, right? We've broken down by portfolio structural risk and portfolio execution risk. And inside each
Sure.
of those, right, there are three leading indicator metrics. Now, again, I think we're missing a few, but and this is the benefit of the community. We're going to build this business case together based on the experiences of the multidisciplinary leaders within the community, right? But in portfolio structural risk, there are kind of three major leading indicator metrics, right? Portfolio misalignment is one of them. I think
Right.
alignment of investments is still
Alignment's a big one. Yeah.
it's a huge one, right?
Yeah.
It's probably the biggest silent killer, right? And we can talk about it more from maybe the project program portfolio management side of the house, but the alignment of the operational activity and spend is as critical, right? But you think about portfolio alignment, based on different portfolio planning techniques you may be using, annual planning, bottom-up planning, suboptimal capabilities, you could be leaving from our research around 26% of the portfolio value on the table, right? This is, for work or projects or investments that you may not even be aware that you should be doing, right? You've got the wrong mix of work in the first place, right? Then you go into things like, redundancy between initiatives. So if you don't have structured business and enterprise architecture capabilities, if you don't have an enterprise function that's looking across all the work that's happening in different silos in the organizations, maybe you are going to have projects impacting different but the same capabilities in the organization, right? So
Yeah,
you're going to be losing value from the fact that you're funding similar investments, right? So there's about 7% of value we see for low performing organizations that don't have that right architectural discipline established. So and then we've also looked at because that focuses more on the discretionary activity and spend. We also looked at the kind of operational activity and spend, which is huge, right? Because if we're not optimizing the operational or the operating fabric of our business, which we have a principle dedicated to, right? It's like dragging an anchor in terms of how your organization is going to be able to execute, right? So we all
yeah,
know that
absolutely.
over time, organizations have grown through whatever, just through investments or M&A activity or whatever it may be, right? So their operating fabric has become bloated, right? So by having more structured business and enterprise architecture capabilities, there's an opportunity to rationalize that operational spend, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
And I think that's like just to pull in that point a little bit more. I think as business architects and architects and just in general, right? We have such an important role to play because fundamentally those building blocks of the organization and being able to sort of articulate how change might impact or touch certain areas of the organization, that's almost super foundational to be able to then light up those different areas, whether it be the portfolio alignment activities, the change management activities, right? So as architects, I feel like we do a lot of this really good work, but we don't do enough to really connect it to what matters for the different groups within that village. And I think as a whole, as a practice, if we're not building those relationships and we're not helping others understand how that information could be used to either increase value or create a richer story, we're really short of the mark of where we could be going.
I think you're absolutely right, right? And I think it's almost bigger than that, right? Because you think about when people talk about misalignment, when I talked about the redundancy of those initiatives, a lot of the times that's coming from more of the enterprise PMO or PMO that's just looking to align and optimize discretionary activity and spend, right?
Yep.
So and that is what 30 to 20% of the overall operating budget of the organization, right? I mean,
Yeah.
to me, and this is why when we defined strategy execution as a community, I don't have the full definition. There's a short paragraph, medium and long definition. But the key element of that for me was the alignment and optimization of all activity and spend, not just the major initiatives. So strategy execution is much more than
Right.
just program management on steroids, right? But the operational activity and spends, which represents the operating fabric of our business, which again, if that is not optimized, it is like dragging an anchor in terms of how you're going to execute, right? So when there are we don't need to get into it now, but I talk about different techniques for top-down planning and enterprise-driven being the main approach. Architecture has a key role to play, right? Because how do we ensure that we can align all activity and spend? I know instinctively, and just I don't know my life, how to align project activity with strategy. But we need to be able to look at the 80% bucket and align that with the strategy and ensure that we're optimizing the operating fabric of our business, which aligns with principle 4 out of the 10 key principles of master strategy execution, which is map and optimize the organization operating blueprint. And architecture plays a key role. But I think why we in the community said map and optimize, because a lot of times I think as architects we can just map stuff, right? But it's map and optimize and significantly improve that operating fabric of the business so that we can execute effectively, right? Yes, that's going to
Right.
result in better project success rates and other things, but we are actually optimizing the business for executing on that strategy. So that is huge in itself. So that goes beyond just talking to the other teams, like the project teams, in terms of how their projects fit in. That's really ensuring that that operating fabric of our business, the foundation of our business, is moving in the right direction relative to whatever strategies are in play.
Yeah, I love that because I always think about expectations versus the reality, right? Like we expect if we invest in these areas or that we focus the growth and maturity on certain capabilities and areas of the business, that it will meet our objectives. But really, the reality is, where do we really put all of our resources, our budgeting, and our time? And that gets exposed through what projects or initiatives or things are in the pipeline today. And being able to marry those two things up to be able to understand, here's the expectations, this is the reality, though, is so absolutely beneficial and really speaks to, you can't just do that in a silo. You truly do need multiple teams coming together to sort of build that perspective and view.
And I think this goes back to the pitch to the C-suite, right? I
Absolutely.
think when we come to the C-suite, it as an individual function, or even when we come collectively, we want to talk to them about the why this is important, not how it's done, right? Because let's just start with the project people. Having a religious debate in terms of whether I'm going to use a waterfall technique, an agile technique, or somewhere in the middle is irrelevant. I've always said, right? I mean, it's all about value, and obviously the PMI is now saying that. You're going to lose your job if you fail to deliver that value, right? Whether you pick agile, whether you pick waterfall, I mean, that's
Scaled
just how you're going to
agile.
do it. Who cares?
Yeah.
I mean, executive cares about, what is it? When am I going to, what is, how much value, when am I going to get it? And how much does it cost? And of course, we then drill down into who have the right people, but that's kind of, secondary to those other things, right? They don't care about how you're going to deliver. You're paid as practitioners, project managers, program managers to know how to do that. I feel a little bit the same with architecture, right? You get lost in the weeds of that. It's very important. We need capabilities and sub capabilities. We need value streams and value stream stages and processes. That's the how. The why you want to do it is because we need to ensure the operating fabric of our business is aligned with the strategy, it's rationalized and optimized so that we can move quickly, right? And
Oh,
so if we can go and tell that why story from the PMO side, from the architect side, because I truly believe, and no, I invested and built strategic portfolio management software, which in my mind was business architecture and portfolio management.
mhm.
Two sides of the same coin in strategic portfolio management, right? Because you that gives you the view of
Yes.
all spend and activity, operational and discretionary, right? But we don't need to get into how you build your business architecture, right? Because you're going to have a
Well,
team, you're
exactly.
going to have a team of architects that are going to do this, right? But all the execs need to know is by doing this, this, and this, from
Yep.
an architecture point of view, by doing this, this, and this, we are plugging those leaks in those leading indicator metrics, which is going to result in more throughput of value at an accelerated pace, right? Now,
A hundred
yes,
percent. Yeah. You said something there that I just want to pull on for just a second, which I think is really important for architects or those who are kind of listening to this really understand. There's a difference between the how of do you build your architecture. So those are the things like the capabilities and the value streams. They're important and you need them, but they shouldn't be the bulk of the focus when we're talking about how do we provide value and how do we create this village together. If we're not using those things that we are creating in order to curate, frame, provide a perspective on actual business problems or strategies, or pushing the envelope on trying to articulate change, then we're missing a significant part of what makes architecture super important in order to help support that village. And I just think as our speakers are listening to that, it's just a really important part. If there's one thing to say what the building blocks are, there's another thing to actually apply it in order to get to results of decisions and change articulation.
no, absolutely. I think that's why I said earlier. I think the most important thing we can do as individual functions within that village is get together to get that C-suite buy-in, to understand what strategy execution is, understand the role of these critical functions and how integrating those into a cohesive operating model is going to give you a multiplier effect in terms of value realized, right?
Right.
And that's going to be the big difference, right? Having that C-suite sponsorship, which should result in a enterprise function that's established. We call it a strategy execution office, but the name is irrelevant because it's more the mindset of it's not just about projects and programs. It's not just about
Right.
architecture. It's not just about change, right? It's about all of that to
All of
to
it
to
together.
maximize value. And it's also doesn't have to be expensive, right? And goes back to what I said earlier, right? we don't want to reactively create this thing when things have come off the rails, right? We want to proactively create this because let's face it, I mean, some organizations have established architecture, some don't, right?
Right.
And there's a bit of a lead time to build that out, right? And so we want to proactively do this so that we have that there, and it doesn't have to be expensive because when it's reactively done, it normally results in a consulting organization, let's say Big Four, Big Five, whatever, coming in, you pay the price tag for that. Where I think you can have that office be the lean architects and the business
Hmm.
architects should be included in that of that strategy execution muscle. But it's more about bringing the existing teams and functions together that all have a voice in terms of how that cohesive operating model should work. Because you've still got to go and do your day job, right? You've still got to go and map your architecture, optimize your architecture like you would do, right? Whether that's capability centric or value stream centric, whatever it's going to be, right?
Right.
Um, but how does that fit in, and how does that fit into an overall operating model, right? And I think that's the challenge, right? I mean, getting that C-suite
Yeah.
buy-in, focus on if I trust me, if I fix this, and this, then value is going to flow on the back end rather than waiting a year to say, okay, well, we didn't experience all the value that we were expecting, right?
Absolutely. And I think the word that stood out there was the trust me part, right? As I think about the 10 principles, I think about like how do we move, how do we create that village and get this in front of the C-suite because that's where that influence is going to be most beneficial. I think maybe architecture practices maybe need to take a step back and look at who they're connecting with today. If it's mostly engineering teams, or if it's a very, very limited set of stakeholders, then we're probably doing it wrong. We are doing it wrong, right? Um, but really assessing who we're interacting with and understanding inherently what are each of these groups trying to do and to build that community. So now with that being said, these are really, really great things to keep in mind, but this doesn't happen overnight. Like it takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of building of that trust and following through on those promises that we're making. Is it possible to do this in a grassroots way, or to maybe start building up villages, small villages? Could we be successful there?
You're going to get some success, right? But I truly believe the thing, as I said earlier, that needs to be there is the C-suite buy-in to this is a critical discipline, right? Um, because that is one of the only true ways that you are going to get the village members to play well in the sandbox together, right? Because, and so it's the collective C-suite understanding it, right? With then, an accountable C-suite member that strategy execution function reports to, the lean
Hmm.
function of architects that are going to, build the village, right, or integrate the village. I think that, because that's the only way to solve this top down. Because we've been trying to solve this, laterally and up for the last 20 years, right? And the benefit of the collective buy-in from the C-suite is that each one of those C-suite members also is, an owner of a critical function, right?
Right.
So, so yes, if it's the chief strategy officer that decides that they're going to, or is appointed the owner, it's not just about strategy decomposition, right? And the CFO needs to ensure the FP&A team are playing well in there. If it's the CFO that's the appointed owner, right? It can't all just be about rear view, financial reporting, right? It's got to also understand architecture and the other things about it, right? So that collective ownership is going to help, or that collective buy-in to needing to solve this will ensure that their respective teams, you know, play well in that kind of partnership mode where these architects, strategy execution architects, are going to try and develop that muscle across the organization. Um,
Right. Yeah, I mean I mean what you're describing there is absolutely needed for this to be able to work because I do think, to your point, we have kind of tried to do this within our own and then try to bring it up, and that doesn't necessarily work. I do think that the C-suite buy-in is incredibly important here, but I also think that Realistically, anyone in that village needs to understand how much influence or how much ability do they have to be able to control the situation today, and how much lateral control do they have on building the relationships that are going to be needed in order to get that group together to be able to have that conversation at the C-suite.
And they have to want to, right? That's the other thing, right? Because
Absolutely.
there's, that the human obstacle. I mean, we can talk about frameworks all day long, right? But ultimately, it's the human obstacle to this. You've got to want to participate in this, right?
Right.
Uh,
Well,
uh,
what's in it for me,
yeah,
right?
yeah, and that's why it can't be there's a danger that people think about this that it's going to become this heavily bureaucratic governance process, right? That's going to control everything you do from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed, right? It can't be that way, right? It's about establishing the lean enterprise controls, right? Um, that are kind of non-negotiable, and then allow the key functions that we've talked about to be able to still operate with autonomy in terms of doing their job. I've got to go and do architecture. I've got to go and execute projects, right? But
Right.
I've got to come back to ensure we're touching on these minimal enterprise controls needed to provide that direct line of sight from strategy for execution, right? And this is, ultimately, the human obstacle of this is huge, right? Because this is not just about ensuring architecture plays well with project people, and this is ensuring that the frontline workers understand the strategy and feel motivated to execute on the strategy and understand their role in that. We're building a cohesive operating model or a machine, to be able to execute on a strategy, and everyone should understand their role to play, right? Whether you're
That's right.
contributing to a project or whether you're you're responsible for building out the capability model, right?
Absolutely. I kind of think of it as for those who are strengths leader based, all of these different areas and functions all play together. They have our unique strengths. There are certain things that we do really, really well together. There's no single group in an organization that does everything perfectly. So we've got to be able to create some wins there together. Um, let's zoom out for just 1 second here. So if listeners remember only one thing from today's conversation, and as they're looking through the presentation and the different principles and the root causes, what's one thing from today's conversation that you would like listeners to walk away with?
But I think this is a multidisciplinary problem, right? And that's it, right? So you can't go it alone. And my conclusion, we'll see if I'm proven right, is that to solve this, it's really about bringing multidisciplinary leaders together to figure out what's going to work for them. And working for them is the important thing, right? It's how well we bring these teams together and how you personalize that operating model versus going it alone, because my function is obviously critical because it's my career and how I'm going to progress myself, right, personally
Sure.
and professionally. Um, so I think that it is a multidisciplinary problem, and I know that strategy execution forum is relatively new, right? Let's say it's 6 months old, and I've been in this space 30 years. I probably learned more in the last 6 months than I learned, in the last 30 years, just simply because of these multidisciplinary discussions.
Yeah.
Understanding the role of architecture. You don't need to be an expert in architecture, but understanding the why of architecture and how it should plug in. The same way the architects understanding, the why of other things and how they plug seamlessly in and get the multiplier effect. As I say, it's a team sport, right?
Absolutely.
And again, it's the other thing is no, there's no textbook way of solving this. Right? There's
Right.
no one size fits all of doing this because of what we said. Everything's got to be personalized to the idiosyncrasies and culture of each organization, which is another reason why I established the Strategy Execution Forum to develop a playbook for strategy execution that rejects one size fits all approaches and provides community best practices or plays for mastering each of the 10 principles, right? So we talked about misalignment, principle 3, translate and communicate strategic direction, right? I could think of 3 or 4, 5 textbook techniques for translating strategy across the organization, right? But what's working, right? And so we're going to crowdsource these plays, and there's more rights than wrongs, right? There isn't just one way of doing it.
That's absolutely right. Where can people learn more about the Strategy Execution Forum, the work that you're doing, and maybe get involved?
Yeah, you go to strategyxf.com. Yeah, and apply to join, right? We're looking, as I say, we're not looking to redefine how architecture is done, right? We will continue to partner with Linda and BAFT and all the architecture experts. We have a number of members from the BAFT community already, but we are trying to figure out how the architecture teams can play well in the sandbox and contribute to that cohesive operating model. So join, we're looking for, multidisciplinary leaders that can provide the architecture point of view alongside the operation point of view, the strategy point of view, the program portfolio management, FP&A, HR. I mean, the number of roles that need to come together is, is staggering at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Well, Ben, I really appreciate your time. This has been a fantastic conversation. I'm super excited to connect with you later and see how that value conversation goes out as you're starting to collect all that research and pull that together. And I'm really excited to see where the Strategy Execution Forum heads next.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
thank you for having me.
All right, this has been the Practice Exchange from Concept to Reality. If you found this information useful, please share it with someone that you are building your practice with, because remember, great ideas don't create impact, the applied practice does. We'll see you next time.